For 3 years he watched her across the fence, too afraid to speak, too deeply in love to look away. Subscribe to Wild Sky Stories' new emotional tales every day. The Wyoming territory stretched endless under a copper sunset, and Elijah Cole stood at the fence line that separated his land from hers. 3 years, 3 long years he had watched her from this very spot, his heart carrying a weight heavier than any bale of hay he had ever lifted. Sarah Mitchell moved across her front porch like a gentle wind, her auburn hair catching the last light of day. She was hanging laundry on the line, her hands working with the efficiency of a woman who had learned to survive alone. Her husband had died in a cattle drive accident 4 years ago, leaving her with 40 acres, a small herd, and a silence that seemed to swallow the prairie whole. Elijah removed his hat and ran weathered fingers through his dark hair. He was 34 years old, owner of the largest ranch in the county, and yet he felt like a nervous boy whenever she glanced his way. He had rebuilt barns after storms, broken wild horses, faced down rustlers with nothing but his courage and a steady hand. But telling Sarah Mitchell that he loved her, that terrified him more than anything. The first time he truly saw her was at the general store in town. She had been reaching for flour on a high shelf, and when she turned, their eyes met. Hers were the color of spring grass after rain, and something in his chest shifted permanently. He had helped her carry her supplies to her wagon that day, their fingers brushing briefly over a sack of sugar. She had smiled and thanked him, calling him a kind neighbor. Neighbor. That word had haunted him ever since. He watched her finish with the laundry and disappear inside her modest farmhouse. The windows glowed warm with lamplight, and he imagined her sitting by the fire, perhaps reading or mending clothes. He wondered if she ever felt lonely. He wondered if she ever looked toward his ranch and thought of him. Winter came hard that year, as it always did in Wyoming. The snow piled high against the buildings, and the wind howled like something hungry and alive. Elijah rode the fence lines daily, checking for damage, ensuring his cattle had access to feed, but his path always seemed to curve toward the boundary between his land and hers. One morning he noticed no movement at the Mitchell place. The barn door hung open, banging in the wind. Fear gripped his heart like a cold fist. He pushed his horse through the drifts, arriving at her door within minutes. He knocked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. When she answered, his fear transformed into something deeper. Sarah stood in the doorway wrapped in a thin shawl, her face pale, her eyes glazed with fever. She tried to speak but swayed dangerously. Elijah caught her before she fell. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, and he carried her to the bed in the corner of the main room. The fire had died to embers, and the house held a bitter chill. He worked through the morning, rebuilding the fire, heating water, finding blankets to pile over her shivering form. He made broth from dried meat he found in her pantry and coaxed her to drink small sips. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling out names he did not recognize, sometimes gripping his hand with surprising strength. For 3 days, he did not leave her side. He tended her cattle, fixed the barn door, hauled water from the frozen creek. At night he sat in the chair beside her bed, watching the firelight dance across her features, praying to whatever power might listen that she would recover. On the 4th morning, her fever broke. She opened her eyes, truly seeing him for the first time since he had arrived. Confusion crossed her face, followed by something he could not quite name. "Mr. Cole," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "What are you doing here?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. "Your barn door was open in the storm. I came to check on you, found you burning up with fever." She looked around the room, taking in the roaring fire, the kettle steaming on. The stove, the evidence of his constant presence. When her gaze returned to him, there were tears in her eyes. "You've been here the whole time." He nodded, not trusting his voice. "Why?" The question was barely audible. Elijah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the white landscape. His reflection stared back at him, tired and uncertain. He had kept his feelings hidden for so long that speaking them felt like trying to move a mountain with bare hands. "Because I couldn't bear the thought of something happening to you," he finally said. "Because every morning for 3 years, I've looked toward this house hoping to catch a glimpse of you. Because when I saw you at the general store that first time, something in me changed forever." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the wind against the windows. He kept his back to her, unable to face whatever emotion might be in her eyes. "Elijah." She said his given name for the first time, and it sounded like music. "Please look at me." He turned slowly. She had pushed herself up against the pillows, her hair tangled, and her face still bearing traces of illness. But she had never looked more beautiful to him. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" she asked. "I didn't think you could want me. You had a husband you loved. I was just the neighbor who waved from across the fence." He shook his head, and I was afraid of losing even the small moments I had, seeing you hang Andre, watching you tend your garden. If you rejected me, even those would be gone. Sarah's tears spilled over now, tracking silently down her cheeks. "I thought you were just being polite, a kind neighbor doing his duty. I never imagined." "You never imagined what?" She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting in the blanket. "That someone like you could love someone like me, a widow barely keeping her land together, a woman with nothing to offer but calloused hands and a worn-out heart." Elijah crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside her bed. He took her hands in his, feeling the roughness of work and the delicate bones beneath. "Sarah Mitchell, you are everything, everything I have ever wanted. Every sunrise I see, I wish I could show it to you. Every good thing that happens on my ranch, I wish I could share it with you. My house is the biggest in the county, but it feels empty because you are not in it." She cupped his face with trembling hands, her thumbs brushing across his cheekbones. "I've been so lonely," she confessed. "I told myself I was content, that I didn't need anyone. But there were nights when the wind howled, and I would look toward your ranch, see the lights in your windows, and wish so desperately that I wasn't alone." "You don't ever have to be alone again," he promised. "If you'll have me, if you could ever find it in your heart to love a man who watched you from afar because he was too much of a coward to speak." She smiled through her tears, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "I think I started loving you the day you helped me with my supplies at the general store. I just didn't know what to call it." He pressed his forehead to hers, breathing her in, feeling the warmth that had nothing to do with her recently broken fever. This was the warmth of hope, of possibility, of a future suddenly painted in colors he had never dared imagine. Spring came slowly to the Wyoming territory, but when it arrived, it transformed the land. The snow melted, revealing green grass that seemed impossibly bright after months of white. Wildflowers burst across the meadows in waves of purple and yellow. The creek ran high and clear, carrying the last of winter's ice to distant rivers. Elijah and Sarah walked together along the fence line that had once separated them. She had recovered fully, stronger now than before, and he visited her every day. Sometimes he helped with repairs around her place. Sometimes they simply sat on her porch and talked, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their fears. He learned that she had married young to a man her father had chosen. It had not been a bad marriage, but it had not been love. Not the consuming, all-encompassing love that she felt now. She learned that he had avoided marriage because he had never found a woman who made him feel complete, until he saw her reaching for that bag of flour in the general store. The town began to talk, as small towns always do. They saw Elijah's horse tied outside Sarah's farmhouse at all hours. They noticed how he looked at her when they walked together down the main street. Some whispered that it was improper, a wealthy rancher courting a struggling widow, but most smiled knowingly, recognizing a love story when they saw one. On a warm evening in late May, Elijah brought her to his ranch for the first time. He had prepared a meal himself, simple fare but made with care. They ate by candlelight, and afterward, he showed her the view from his back porch. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "This is beautiful," she breathed. "It's better with you here," he said. "Everything is better with you here." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold ring, one that had belonged to his mother. He had carried it with him for weeks, waiting for the right moment. "Sarah," he began, and his voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Sarah, I have loved you from afar for 3 years. Now that I know you, now that I have held your hand and heard your laughter and seen the way you squint when you're thinking hard about something, I love you even more. I don't want another fence between us. I don't want to wave from a distance anymore." He held up the ring, and the fading sunlight caught the gold, making it gleam. "Will you marry me? Will you let me spend every morning waking up beside you? Will you share this land with me? Build a life with me? Grow old with me?" Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, and tears streamed down her face. She nodded before she could speak, and when words finally came, they tumbled out in a rush. "Yes, yes, Elijah. 1,000 times yes. I love you. I have loved you longer than I knew, and I will love you for whatever years we have left on this earth." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her for the first time. It was a kiss that held all the years of longing, all the silent watching, all the dreams that had seemed impossible. It was a kiss that tasted like promises, and smelled like spring flowers, and felt like coming home. They married in the small church in town on a Sunday morning in June. The whole community came, filling the wooden pews to overflowing. Sarah wore a dress of cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and wildflowers woven into her hair. Elijah wore his best suit, the one he had ordered from a catalog and never had occasion to use. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer went up from the gathered crowd, but Elijah barely heard it. He was looking into Sarah's eyes, seeing his future reflected there, and thinking that every moment of longing, every lonely night, every fear that had kept him silent, had been worth it to arrive at this moment. They combined their lands, though Elijah would have been happy to give, say, everything he owned. She insisted on continuing to work, refusing to become an idle ranch wife. Together, they built the largest and most prosperous ranch in the territory. But their true wealth was not measured in cattle or acres. Their true wealth was measured in quiet evenings by the fire, in shared laughter over morning coffee, in the way they still held hands after years of marriage. It was measured in the children who came later, a boy with his father's dark hair and a girl with her mother's green eyes. It was measured in the legacy they built, not just of land and livestock, but of a love that had started with glances across a fence and grown into something that would outlast them both. Years later, old and gray, and still deeply in love, they would sit on that same back porch where he had proposed. The sunset would paint the sky in familiar colors, and Sarah would rest her head on Elijah's shoulder. "Do you remember the fence?" she would ask. "I remember everything," he would reply. "Every moment of watching you from afar, every second of wishing I could speak. I'm glad you finally did. So am I, my love. So am I." And as the stars emerged over the Wyoming territory, they would sit together in comfortable silence. Two people who had found each other against all odds, whose love had begun with distance, but ended in the closest embrace the world had ever known. The old fence line still ran across the land, though it served no purpose now. The posts had weathered and grayed, and some had fallen entirely. But Elijah refused to remove it completely. It stood as a reminder of where they had begun, of the barrier that love had ultimately overcome. Because love, he had learned, was patient. Love waited through long winters and uncertain springs. Love watched from afar when it had to, but never stopped hoping. And when the moment finally came, love crossed every fence, bridged every distance, and made two separate lives into one unbreakable whole. That was the story of Elijah Cole and Sarah Mitchell, a story of patience and longing, a story of fear and courage, a story that began with a rancher watching his neighbor from across a fence and ended with two hearts beating as one under the endless Wyoming sky.